Welcome to our first talkie for Art History 213, which is PAFA's designation for non-Western art history. The image on the slide right now at the left is the cover of our textbook. It is a book that I do believe you're going to need in an online course format, so please be sure that you get it. In addition to the textbook, I will be uploading talkies like this one into Canvas. Nevertheless, I do believe you're going to benefit greatly from actually acquiring the book. The title of the course, I guess we should start with first, it's a little problematic. Every time I teach this course, I hesitate in terms of what to call it. There are three terms that are generally used for art that is outside the West. One of them is non-Western. That's the designation that's being used by our registrar at PAFA. The other is traditional art. And then the term that tended to be used maybe 20 years ago was primitive art. I think that you can recognize that there are problems with all three of these designations. The primitive art is pretty easy to get. Something primitive implies that it is unsophisticated and clearly unequal to our own standards. So that designation, generally speaking, has been eliminated. Although you're going to still find a number of books today that might be in the library shelves that have primitive art as a title. Okay, so traditional art. Well, what is wrong with that? Traditional art implies artwork that's produced by a culture that doesn't show progress, doesn't accept change, in other words, doesn't grow. And again, by Western standards, that's our standards, that would be inferior. In fact, in non Western cultures, societies, and groups, there is change. Change does occur, not in the same way that it occurs in the West, but it does take place. And that also applies to art, which does go through evolutions, which as we go through the course, we might get some idea of that. In particular, we can see it in North America with some of the pottery forms and some of the weavings that continue to be produced today. That's one easy place to document growth and evolution and adaptation. The last one, non-Western, is a little bit more difficult to find fault with, but I would like you to think about this for a second. But it too does have a kind of a subconscious bias associated with it. And that is the implication that the art that we're going to be looking at actually has nothing to do with us, that it is, in fact, work that comes from the other people who are not like us, people who are other than us, people who are different. With that comes the implication that those others are inferior. That, of course, we know is not true, but nevertheless, it is implied with the term non Western. So, if you take a look at our textbook, probably the best way of talking about this art is art beyond the West, or sometimes it's also referred to as global art. But I like art beyond the West, which means that it is art outside, and that literally means beyond the geographic borders of the influence of Western culture and Western aesthetics, politics, and religion. This is a map of the world, which will help us to get a little bit better handle on that. The areas of influence include Europe, and of course, Europe's located right here, and its colonies. And that implies the United States as well, because we begin as a colony of England, and we maintain very strong traditions and contacts that come from Europe. So it's going to refer to the course material that we're going to be studying is going to be course material that was not influenced by those two primary sources. This means that we'll be looking at cultures in North America and South America before contact. We'll also be looking at cultures that come to us from Africa, and we will be looking at cultures from Asia and from the Arabian Peninsula. Those are all areas that produced high civilizations without necessarily being influenced by Europe or any of its colonies. Western influence comes as a kind of package. It engages culture, but also aesthetics, politics, and religion. Because this is an art history course, we're going to be spending a lot of time on aesthetics. And I would like you to be thinking for a moment about what that means, how you would define it. I'm assuming most of you probably have an idea of what aesthetics means, but I think we need to understand it before we begin to take a look at art beyond the West. Here is a definition for you of aesthetics, a branch of philosophy, so automatically we know this is philosophical, that studies the principles of beauty, artistic theory, and the classifications of art. Oh, that word classifications, I want to come back to that one because that implies one of the problems with using Western aesthetic. Aesthetics then does deal with judging, with determining how to separate different types of art and how to essentially rate those types of art. So we have to ask the question, where do Western aesthetics originate? What's the basic influence on Western aesthetics? And if we were in the classroom, I'm pretty sure at this point, at least one or two of you would quickly know that the source of influence, and that's particularly visible at PAFA, think your cast collection, comes to us from ancient Greece. These, of course, are all works that come to us from ancient Greece. And you do have in Pafa's cast collection the work that's in the lower right, which is the Laocoon, one of the highlights of the cast collection. In fact, I think all three, however, are Greek in origin. The male figure and the female figure are both from the classical period. The Laocoon is from the Hellenistic, the latest of the Greek works, the periods of Greek works of art. All three of these have underlying them qualities of ideal naturalism. And the way in which that artists who produced works in the ancient world were judged was their ability to produce works of art that did, in fact, come very close to a naturalistic or a lifelike rendering, but at the same time in a very ideal way. The non Western world is not going to draw from this tradition. So sometimes it's going to be difficult for us, initially at least, to understand the premises, the ideas behind aesthetics, and the way in which artistic theory and ideas of beauty are arrived at. But we're going to take some time and try and be able to do that. Let's start with these two pieces in our next talkie.